I'm Jake from AAA, and I basically function as AAA's Chief Safety Officer in that I'm not a researcher, I'm a recovering researcher, and I'm not an automotive engineer either. It's really my job to take the work of our automotive engineering team at AAA and of the research staff at the AAA Foundation and apply it to federal regulation, to public policy at the state and federal level, to how we educate consumers, to programs that we provide in schools and in communities throughout the country. So it's a super fun job for me. I'm gonna nerd out with you for 30 minutes and we'll have some fun. We heard from Mr. Reed earlier the importance of taking into account the opinions, the needs, the wants, the desires of consumers when thinking about the next generation of AV technologies that make their way into the vehicle. And AAA represents the consumer. That's why we're here. It's why we're interested in this topic. And so what I'm gonna share with you is some of the work of AAA's automotive engineering team and also the AAA Foundation research in terms of consumer readiness for higher levels of vehicle automation and also their trust in that technology. And so by way of setting the stage a little bit, I mean, you're all in this room, so you're familiar with the fact that there are a lot of people who die on our highways every year. What's really interesting about where we are today is that we are at record high numbers of people killed in traffic crashes on our public roadways. In fact, in 2022, we are reaching almost 43,000 people killed in traffic crashes, which is the highest number that we've recorded in this country since we started recording it at the federal level. And this is despite the advancements that we've made in passing stronger highway safety laws, advancements in vehicle technology and crashworthiness, and better roads and bridges with the safety infrastructure countermeasures that we're all familiar with, like rumble strips, rumble stripes, median cable barriers, those kinds of things. So there's something weird going on right now, and we're kind of at an interesting place in the US in terms of driving down highway fatalities, even though for a long time, since AVs have become a thing here in the US, we've talked about how they can sort of save humans from themselves and drive down the number of highway fatalities. And so we're moving in the wrong direction right now, and it's projected that in 2022, the numbers will be even higher than 43,000. So we have some work to do. In January of this year, the US Department of Transportation, for the first time in its history, issued a report. It was a national roadway safety strategy to address the problem that I just outlined for you in terms of how many people were dying on our public roads. And so the fact that they issued, for the first time, a national roadway safety strategy was really interesting, kind of a landmark thing for the US DOT. But what was really interesting to me as an epidemiologist is that one of the commitments they made in that national strategy is a commitment to using the safe system approach to roadway safety planning. And so this isn't really new in this country to people who work in roadway infrastructure. So the Federal Highway Administration and state DOTs are already applying the principles of the safe system approach, which I'm going to describe to you in just a minute in more detail, but they're already doing it. But in the rest of sort of the other groups within the highway safety community, including the people who design cars and help them to be safer and to protect us on the road, don't really apply or use those principles, and we have an opportunity to do that. So these are the 5 elements of the safe system approach, and it's based on the assumption that humans are really good at finding every possible loophole to death and destruction. We're really good at it. And so we make that assumption that humans are gonna make poor choices and we're gonna get ourselves into trouble. That is the primary assumption of the safe system approach. And so we design the system around the user of the transportation system such that if they do find their way, if we find our way to trouble, which we will at one time or another, that the system has redundancy in terms of layers of protection that will reduce the odds of serious injury or death. And these are the ways that you do it. These are the elements of the safe system, and safe vehicles is a big part of that. So you choose the different layers of protection here so that the odds of a serious injury or crash happening are extremely low. Every layer of protection has to fail for it to happen. And in other developed nations like Australia and Spain, they have used and fully embraced the safe system approach in terms of the way they design their transportation systems and all the elements of it, to the point that they drove down the number of traffic fatalities in their countries by between 50 and 80% over a period of time. That's dramatic. And we are way behind the industrialized world in terms of achieving those same kinds of gains. So this is a study that we did at the foundation. It was just an analysis of data from NHTSA. It's FARS data. And what we did here is we looked at the crashes in that database, and we tried to estimate the crashes that lend themselves to, they're the kinds of crashes that these advanced driver assistance technologies listed up here on the screen were developed to mitigate. So these are candidate fatal crashes that if all cars on the road during this year of data that we analyzed could have potentially prevented. And long story short, what we found is that all of these advanced driver assistance technologies combined, if they were on all vehicles in the fleet that year of FARS data that we analyzed, could have prevented 40% of crashes, 37% of traffic injuries, and 29% of traffic fatalities. So it's not zero, but there's a lot more in terms of advances in vehicle technology that exist even today that didn't at the time of this analysis. And obviously with full automation, these numbers would be higher, but they're not going to solve the problem altogether. That's why there are 4 other elements of the SAFE system. But we have a huge opportunity here, and I know that you all know this because it's why you're in this room. But here's the problem, is those estimates make a wild assumption, which is that humans are behaving rationally and leveraging those technologies in the ways they were meant to be leveraged. That they're aware of the limitations of those technologies and they're not over-relying on them to do things for them that those technologies weren't designed to do or designed to do in certain kinds of environments or situations. And so we did a study with the University of Iowa where we surveyed registered owners of ADAS-equipped vehicles and asked them what they thought of it. Asked them a variety of questions about their knowledge about the technologies that were in their vehicles, and we learned some really interesting stuff. So generally, people really liked the advanced vehicle safety systems in their cars, and they said that 7 out of 10 of them said that they would recommend it to other people and that they would look for these same technologies in another car if they were to buy one. But there were also some major gaps in knowledge about the technologies that they had in their very own vehicles. So as an example, 21% didn't know the limits of their blind spot warning system. 33% were unaware that automatic emergency braking relied on cameras and sensors that would be blocked if dirty or in ice and snow kinds of conditions. So things that we all know in this room, but the average consumer, not all of them know that. And so in those kinds of environments are going to rely on these technologies to do things for them that the technology can't do because of the environment that it's being used in. And if you become accustomed to letting technology in your vehicle do these things for you and then suddenly they don't, you can see where things can go sideways. And so this is problematic. So another study that we did tried to look at how sort of the mental models that we hold as users of technologies like these change over time. And so in this study, we had a group of drivers who were registered owners of ADAS-equipped vehicles, and then provided a group of drivers similar kinds of cars for a period of 4 weeks. And what we looked for were sort of the differences in how they behaved and what they knew and understood about these kinds of technologies. And what we found is that experienced drivers, people who own these vehicles already and had driven with them many, many times, were really comfortable with them, were twice as likely to engage in distracted driving behaviors when the level 2 systems were on as compared to when they were off. And when we look at drivers who were relatively new to this technology, wasn't the same outcome. So they were more engaged in the driving task and monitoring the driving environment and not engaging in those other kinds of activities, those secondary tasks while behind the wheel, even when the systems were engaged. So let's take a look now at how people feel about sharing the road with fully automated vehicles. So you've probably heard of the AAA Traffic Safety Culture Index. So there's a theme. This is a survey of motorists that AAA does every year. We've done it for like 8 or 9 years, and we ask about all kinds of things. Vehicle technology related and otherwise, like drunk driving, distracted driving, all kinds of things. And there's a theme in this survey that is do what I say, not what I do, and generally people think that they are all above average. 100% of people think that they are above average, which obviously cannot be. So, you know, people might have more comfort being the one behind the wheel in a vehicle equipped with these kinds of technologies, but when it comes to sharing the road with a higher level of automation, people become a lot less comfortable with that because they don't have any control. They don't know where these vehicles are, how to know or anticipate what they're going to do or how they're going to behave in different circumstances. So we partnered with the Harvard Kennedy School to survey US drivers about this very thing. And so let's take a look at some of what we found. I think the punchline here is that regardless of the kinds of roads that fully automated vehicles could travel on, or the kinds of vehicles that were fully automated, people were generally not comfortable with it. They had lots of anxiety about it. And so you can see here that that column of less safe is where a majority in every case of respondents were found, or they were just simply unsure about it. So let's look at the next slide here. So they also gave us some advice. What are the kinds of things that we could do, that decision makers could do to provide some comfort to them and to reduce the anxiety that they experienced about sharing the road with fully automated vehicles? And so the top two candidates here were clearly marking vehicles that were self-driving, having designated lanes for fully automated vehicles, and then a distant third is restrictions on the time of day or the day of week that fully automated vehicles could use the road. There may be some problems with that one. So let's shift gears now and stay on this sort of track of how can we reduce fears? How can we reduce anxiety? And what can we do and what can we study and what kinds of questions can we answer to try to figure out how we can make consumers more comfortable and less fearful and develop higher degrees of trust in technology that can actually help make them safer on the road. So in this particular study, we had a group of drivers, about 40 drivers between the ages of 25 and 65. The technology that we were sort of focusing our analysis on was adaptive cruise control. And what we did was we monitored these drivers for a period of 6 months to look at how their mental models evolved over that period of 6 months. The difference between the two groups in the study is that one group was learn as you go, trial and error. They received no specific education or training other than what comes with the vehicle and the owner's manual. The other half of the group received a highly intensive but very short sort of blitz of education and training that was hands-on about the technologies and systems in their car. And at the end of the 6 months, what we found was that both groups were more knowledgeable about the technologies in their vehicle. But the group that was the trial and error group still had major gaps in what they understood to be true about the technologies in their car and what they could do and what they couldn't do, with the limits of them, or that kind of stuff. The group that received the highly intense training fared far better, much more knowledgeable, had a much more accurate, sort of knowledge-based, accurate mental model of what the systems in their vehicle could do for them, when they would and wouldn't work, and how they were to be used, and understood to a greater degree that they were there to help complement them as drivers and not to replace them entirely as drivers, and that they still needed to monitor the driving environment. We also uncovered a very small, overconfident group of drivers in the learn as you go, trial and error group, that were convinced that they had mastered everything there was to know about their cars. And the irony is that they, among those who did the trial and error learning process, had the least accurate knowledge about the knowledge in their vehicle, but were highly confident that they had mastered it. Now, this is a problem. This is where edge case problems start to happen. So on this theme of like words matter, this is an interesting study that we did where we had, the vehicle was a 2018 Cadillac CT6 equipped with Super Cruise. But we sort of tried to do our best to de-identify it. So it was just like a benign car. And we put a group of drivers in this car 90 participants, all in the same vehicle, and they were on a pre-mapped section of interstate roadway in the Maryland area. And half of the group received information, like educational information, a short video, like promo video, educational pamphlet, like print material, that were realistic, but sort of not real branded names for that technology. One focused on the capabilities of what the system could do for the driver and minimize the limitations of what that technology could do for the driver. That was AutonoDrive. And Drive Assist really emphasized the importance of driver responsibility, that this technology is meant to assist you, not replace you behind the wheel, and highlighted what some of the system limitations were before the driver got on the road. And so these are the two treatment groups. They got to drive on this section of roadway. There was a researcher in the passenger seat of the car the entire time, asking questions, monitoring the situation, collecting information. And at the end of the day, no shocker, the group who received the AutonoDrive promotional materials were far more let down and disappointed in their experiences as compared to what they felt they had been sold. So 42% of the of the folks who received the AutonoDrive education expressed that sentiment, whereas only 11% of the Drive Assist arm of the study reported being let down or that they had been sold something that didn't deliver on how it had been marketed or communicated. And so this is just a study that I think emphasizes the point that the words that we use, how we sell and promote the technologies in cars can make people really happy and impress them, or they can be very underwhelmed and disappointed. It can also really mislead people to develop overconfidence in systems that aren't fair to the technology because it's not what it was designed to do. And so while I think that it's fair to understand that automakers want to sell cars and they want to promote their technologies, and I think that we should expect that, but I think there is a responsible and honest and transparent way to do that that helps set consumers up for success to maximize the safety that they get from the technologies in the cars versus leading them down the wrong path to overconfidence and disappointment and what their experience is with these systems is compared to what they were sold in marketing and branding materials. On this theme of words matter, you can see these different organizations up here: Safety Council, SAE, PAVE. NHTSA should be up there now because NHTSA has endorsed this as well. AAA went through an exercise where we analyzed all the make and model cars during a particular model year and that were equipped with different advanced driver assistance technologies and looked at what names they were given. And for automatic emergency braking, there were 40 different names for that technology. For a majority of the names that were included in the analysis, it was roughly around 20 different names on average for the same kind of technology. Even though they're not all the same implementation, the intent of these technologies is the same, and they had all these wildly different names. So we're not really doing consumers justice and helping them to sort of understand consistently what these technologies are and how one might be different from another. If even automatic emergency braking is gonna exist in this world by 40 different names, how are we not confusing consumers? And so the point of this, this report, this exercise, this analysis was to try to develop very benign and common and simple names that reflect the intended functionality of the technology and emphasize less sort of branding, marketing kinds of words, like AutonoDrive, for example. And the hope is that industry will grab onto these and not abandon their sort of marketing or branded labels for these technologies, but to use those marketing and branded names to describe the technologies as written in this report, so that people say, oh, that's what it is. It's blind spot warning, even if an OEM calls it something else. This is Nissan's version of blind spot warning, just to provide some consistency there and develop some fair expectations for consumers. So I'm at the tail end of this talk, and I wanted to share with you some of the work that we have coming up. These are all studies, and this is just some of them, that are coming out of the AAA Foundation in the next 6 to 9 months. So the first one here, evaluating advanced vehicle technology's impact on driver workload. We're doing this with David Strayer and his team at the University of Utah, and we're trying to look at how do you titrate and find that balance between driver arousal and the workload that these technologies create or eliminate for drivers. We don't want to create an environment in a level of vehicle automation where there's an expectation that motorists are going to be aware and engaged in monitoring the driving environment, but we've reduced the workload in the driver to such a great degree that he or she might fall asleep behind the wheel. That we're almost creating an environment that is conducive to them engaging in secondary tasks that will create takeover readiness problems for the driver. And so the point of this study is to try to figure out what is that balance and how do you measure it and how do you know when you're there. So that's the guidance that we hope to get out of that study. This third bullet down, measuring takeover readiness in drivers of partially automated vehicles. The intent here is to look for sort of signs and symptoms, behaviors, different biological markers that driver monitoring technologies can collect in the moments before a takeover readiness event, a takeover event, so that OEMs can provide earlier warning that the takeover event is going to happen. That you're starting to fall asleep, you've not looked at the road in a certain amount of time, and give a warning earlier than we can today that, hey, you're going to have to take over the vehicle. You might want to pay attention to where you are and get your bearings straight so that you're ready to operate safely when it's time for you to do that. So providing early warning is the goal there. And then in the last one here, which outcome measures should be used to evaluate the effectiveness of consumer education and training relative to vehicle automation? This is an attempt to try to figure out what is the right amount of education and training that purchasers of new vehicles with these kinds of systems need. Obviously, we want to take up as little time as possible in providing that education. It needs to be high impact, practical, hands-on. But what content do we focus on? What's the most important? And what's the route of delivery that works for different age groups? Men, women, old, young. Experience with these kinds of technologies, complete neophytes to these kinds of technologies. And trying to figure out what works best for different groups of people as compact and powerful as possible is the goal there. So this is some of the work that we have coming out, which I think will be really interesting and helpful. And the goal of all of it is to try to create an environment that helps alleviate some of the anxiety and set consumers up for success in utilizing and maximizing the benefits of these technologies appearing in new vehicles entering the fleet every day. So last slide, some final thoughts and considerations to leave with you. I'm super impressed with the advances in vehicle automation and the building blocks of automated vehicles and in terms of the technologies and what they can do and how they've evolved just in my time at AAA. But I think that there's so much more that OEMs could be doing. And I think about impaired drivers, and impaired by alcohol and other drugs, impaired in terms of being a fatigue driver, medical impairment. In other developed nations, OEMs are using driver monitoring and feedback technology to solve for this problem. Sort of forcing vehicles to slow down and pull over if an impairment of any kind is detected. Impairment just by alcohol, not even other drugs, not including fatigue, not including medical impairment, accounts for 1/3 of all people who die in traffic crashes on our roads each year. And OEMs in the United States have done nothing to solve that. And I know that the technology exists because we've talked to those suppliers. And so I would just say that given the safety status in our country, we're at record high numbers of highway fatalities, look at all industry has done on vehicle automation. Why not apply some of that effort, some of that brain power and goodwill to solve this really important problem too and help drive down traffic fatalities even more? There's no reason why we're not doing that. The second column here is just this notion of equity. And so as new cars enter the fleet with new technologies that make their owners much safer, that are more intuitive and create environments and experiences for consumers where they over-rely or don't understand or misuse the technologies. It's getting better. It's working more often as intended. The people who arguably need these technologies most are the last people who can afford them. So equity, we need to figure out how to get lower income people access to these kinds of technologies too. They are overrepresented in a lot of traffic fatalities and injuries. And I think we owe it to people here to help grant them greater access to technologies that can keep them safe. And then in terms of just like mobility on demand and mobility as a service, there are huge sort of equity considerations that we need to be making in that space too. And I know I didn't cover that topic here, but I know it's going to be covered at some point in this program. And you have to think about the safety of where people can access sort of kiosks to pay for and to check out these kinds of modes of transportation. Lower income people may not have a credit card. And if that's how you pay for it, are there other ways? We have to think about these kinds of things to make sure that we're providing that first mile, last mile access to the people, again, who arguably need it most. So we need to think about equity and how we plan transportation in the US and also here in Tennessee. Whoops. And then the last column here is really just a nod to sort of a change in the tide that I've noticed. And some of the best and brightest minds in research and industry who attend the AAA Foundation's AV forums each year. Is anyone here, raise your hand if you've ever attended one of AAA Foundation's AV forums. Nobody. Tennessee needs to get to one of these forums. They're pretty great. But I would say, so I think there have been 3 so far, maybe 4, I think 3 though. And there are 2 days, and we just have a safe space where we speak freely and talk about what we think is going to work, what's not work, what are the problems, why aren't we moving faster, are we selling it too much, are we not being honest and transparent, what are the problems ahead that haven't been researched yet, who's going to do what. These are the kinds of conversations that we have. And I would say that until this last forum, which was in April this year in Phoenix, generally industry and research minds attending these forums are like, it's right at our fingertips. We're right there. It's going to be here before you know it. And in April of this year, it was a completely different tone. I would say that if I had to summarize that the takeaway for me, I facilitated small groups and had 15 minutes with every single attendee at that forum, facilitating discussions and debates on the same set of questions. And I'd say the big takeaway for me is that the research community and the industry folks who participated in our forum kind of feel like we're 20 years away from full automation in the US, like passenger vehicles, if at all. And among the people that still felt like it was going to happen 20 years plus or minus, that most likely it wasn't going to be passenger vehicles, it was going to be fleets of trucks, shuttle services, those kinds of things. So I feel like that sort of the timeline has changed a little bit. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, because that gives us more time to keep doing our homework, to figure out how to really perfect these technologies and to reduce anxiety and fear and build trust among consumers and what the technologies can do for them. And we should maybe do a little bit more sharing of what we learn in industry relative to safety as it is related to these technologies, just like the airline industry doesn't compete on safety. That information is shared with all airlines to improve air travel. And the Traffic Safety Culture Index that I mentioned before, that AAA does every year, we asked consumers about this. And consumers in the United States, overwhelmingly, 88.5% of them said that they think that OEMs and developers of these technologies should release publicly safety information and the results of their testing of these technologies publicly before those same the vehicles with those technologies are allowed on public roadways. And I agree with that. So those are my final thoughts. I will leave you with that. Thank you so much for not referring to me as Jake from State Farm.